Howdy folks, we're looking at Edge Magazine issue 28. This one released January 1996, which means it's more likely to have been released early December 1995. But nevertheless discussing the future of interactive entertainment, because that's what Edge does. And this cover looks pretty cool. It talks about hip or hype. Now, for some reason on the camera, this kind of looks blurry, but it says video game marketing comes of age, and sure it did. Well, we'll talk a bit more about that later. This was the mid-90s, and there was a society against PlayStation called SAPS. And these are pretty funny commercials with nerdy-looking Americans, and showing how the PlayStation brand would corrupt these average people because of its power. Now, the opening column was about the lengths that video game marketing has gone. Apparently, there were virtual fighter projections on the House of Parliament. And best of all, last month, I didn't know it at the time, it wasn't until I read this magazine, that last month there was a 3DO commercial with feathers, and when you open the magazine, the feathers would pop out apparently, and it's referenced to in this magazine at least 4 times, including this, saying how far video game marketing is going. Well, we'll look more into that. There's also talk about how dangerous video games are in this issue, and this game Into the Darkness being shown, even though the game was never released. And NetView, the new articles, new kind of article, which would be featured every month, but not very long. Interview with a guy who works for Probe. Okay, so this is good news for Trip Hawkins, because apparently Matsushita, which is nowadays just called Panasonic, they give $100 million to the 3DO company for the M2 technology. Not exactly sure what actually ended up happening with the M2 technology, but here we see Trip Hawkins being happy. So, and we have my cat coming inside, but he still has some food, so I think he's okay. Let's continue. Oh, they want talent it, indeed. They want a new editor. We'll see at the end of the magazine. The Nintendo 64 controller is finally revealed, and it has the hollow joystick, which unfortunately never came to be, because I always found the stick to be somewhat annoying. Bad grip. Uh-oh. You want food, don't you? Okay. What else do we have? So this article is about how the Nintendo 64 would take a bit longer to be released, and I think it eventually made it halfway through 1996 into the Western markets. And we see some images of what would end up becoming Final Fantasy VII, but at the time people thought it would be for the Ultra 64. So, some talk about a 3D card for the Macintosh for 3D graphics, and I find that very special. But here we see how the Atari virtual reality set was indeed a bust. The company who would make the VR set in Atari, they had some issues together, and they ended up having some trouble. I guess I'm going to have to feed my cat because he keeps walking back and forth. There was also apparently I need to get some food. Apparently an article in the Daily Mail, or another British newspaper, which was very close to a tabloid, and they mentioned how the it's hard to do all these things at the same time. They mentioned how the virtual reality was not going to continue, and that was bad news for Atari, of course, if a newspaper publishes something like that. And who's to blame for that news? Well, I guess we'll never know. Okay, let's continue. This is kind of cool. This is kind of like a battle.net, but then British. It's a what's supposed to be some kind of program which would allow you to play games against one another via the internet. Of course, most games would have their own servers and connections. So yeah, that didn't turn out to be really necessary. Here's some bad press for video games. Let's see. The Sunday Times talking about distraught people thanks to the endorphin video game or something. Written by the programmer who produced Tetris. And, sorry, the Siri just went on for some reason. So the person who made Tetris, Alex Thingamajig, he apparently made another game called Endorphin, which is, of course, total nonsense. There's also talk about, we just talked about how the VR set, according to the Sunday Times, was not to be released. And something about total reality, I don't know. Okay, let's continue. So the PlayStation was doing well in Japan, and they had a conference showing some new games, including the new Castlevania game, also Tekken 2, Resident Evil, Street Fighter Zero. Let's see, this will sound like a fun book. It's about hackers, but back in the day before there was hacking, I believe. So, 1984. I don't know. Masters of Deception. Kind of like sounds like what the fellow in Catch Me If You Can did. Okay, so letters. What were these about again? I recall one being highly interesting. Can I still come up with that one? Well, there's one person talking about, hey, I had a 3DO, but I see the PlayStation, it's so much better. So another person complaining about the lack of coverage of good Super Nintendo games in Edge. And same thing here. Talk about how the Acorn computers, which were big in Britain, helps you learn programming, how they should be more important because, they help people make their own games. And it's a loss that you can't do that on gaming platforms anymore. And I have to agree with that, but good games are still being made. That one letter I was interested in can't seem to come up. Oh yeah, this was it. This fellow, apparently, he opened up the magazine and the feathers flew out, thanks to the 3DO advertisement last time. And he got into a row in the bus because of all the mess he made. So that was kind of funny. Here's the new NetView, and it discusses a website called IG Online. The IG stands for Intelligent Gamer. And I looked this up on the web. I didn't go so far as to look on the archives, but what I did find was that it did turn into a print magazine from 1997 to 2001 or so. So that's cool. And Edge likes this online magazine at the time, only a website with fantastic HTML graphics. See that headlines in 3D. They like what they see because it's in depth and good news. Could be the case that this website lasted until 2010. I found a website with a similar name, but nothing interesting there. What's really cool is that they show the features of the website. It has pronto news. It has reviews. It has mail. Yeah. Lively email letters page. Lengthy in-depth replies. IG Interactive. So online conferences. The archive. And links. Isn't that funny? Reading about a website in a magazine. So, Electronic Arts making a bunch of sports games. Here's also a new feature called TechView. And later they will put this in the back of the magazine because this is very, well, as you guessed it, very tech heavy. This time they're looking into the Shadows, a game never released, but it was nevertheless a good demonstration of the programming abilities of the company Scavenger. They were mostly known for making demos for the Saturn, and they were featured a while ago. in Edge. I believe the Edge editorial visited them again because later on we'll see more games by Scavenger. Virtual On being shown. This is also a new feature now called Arcade View, because in the mid-90s you could still come across new video arcade games, and I've always had a soft spot for Virtual On because it's a like a 3D arena fighting game. And 19XX, I guess, is a futuristic version of the 1942 top-down shooter because it's made by Capcom. And Crypt Killers is Konami's answer to House of the Dead and Virtual Cop. So, Intel with catchy commercials. Resident Evil being shown. A game I've never liked because of the horrible controls, and I've never found it that exciting. But this review, of course, shows the one part I did find somewhat. Oh, this isn't. No, that's another room. Well, eventually the dogs jump through the window. I thought that was pretty intense. But other than that, I found the game annoying and not smart. Just cheap thrills. But Edge loves what they see, and they would be right because this would become one of the biggest game series of all time. So, yeah, bad voice acting, we all know about that. Great graphics, though. Yeah, it was well made, I can't deny that. But not my kind of thing. Secret of Mana 2, Psychodetsu 3. Would never be reviewed in Edge as far as I know because of no Western release. But very playable in Japanese, of course. And I didn't like it as much as the original Secret of Mana because the fighting was so sloppy. There's hardly any control over your characters. Excuse me. So, yeah, I just found the fighting to just be a grind. I like the bosses better in Secret of Mana 3, but I did play Secret of Mana 1 for the Game Boy. That was actually pretty good. So here's Scorcher and Amok, both games made by Scavenger, which we saw earlier. And I believe this one was released and this one not. This one had great graphics for the Saturn. I don't know about this game, and I'm leaving it at that. Big Red Racing was released, and it looks kind of funny because it has a fairly low polygon count. And it's a tipsy-turvy racing game. Not trying to be realistic, just a lot of fun. Guess kind of like Mario Kart, but more based on physics than on weapons. And it wasn't a big hit. It was made in the UK. That's why Edge probably gave a look at it, because they had close ties to people in the UK. Starfighter, it's a German word, Starfighter, and yeah, released for the Saturn. I don't know how good this game was. I looked it up, but it wasn't clear what people thought of this game, but it exists. So, could be an obscure 2D shoot 'em up. Could be the next best thing after Radiant Silvergun. I wouldn't know. So, Samurai Spirits RPG was released originally for the Neo Geo CD, and then later on for the Saturn and PlayStation. But none of these would be translated, so only in Japanese. And there are probably fan translations now to be found for ROMs. And I heard it's fairly good, actually. Edge talks about that there are two game styles. One is pure fighting, and the other would be more like a traditional RPG, but I don't know exactly what that's like. I didn't take the time to look that up. But if you like Samurai Shodown RPGs, maybe you should take a look to see what they made back then. You can't buy this, so wait for it. That's how Nintendo tried to sell their Ultra 64. Hey, it's Street Fighter Alpha. I have always been a big Street Fighter fan, and I wasn't a big fan of the Alpha series. Gameplay-wise, well, I didn't care much for the new things. You had the meter, which was more important than ever, which was used mostly for two things. Most of all, the super moves, and I always found super moves to be high risk, high reward, and I prefer the fundamentals of the original Street Fighter. And there are also alpha counters, which for intermediate players are mostly just kind of like anti-air moves, and not used at high level as far as I know. I didn't like the Alpha series mostly because of the very pastel-looking graphics. Yeah, the I mean, the gameplay was fine. Wasn't really an improvement on Super Turbo. Throwing was less strong, which I found made the game a bit more defensive. But mostly the graphics and sound didn't really improve, and in fact, I preferred the aesthetics of the original Street Fighter 2. It just seemed all a bit softer, less fighting game-like. And I don't understand why they didn't use more power of the so-called CP2 board, because Street Fighter Alpha looks pretty good on the Super Nintendo, and, well, I guess that says enough. Hey, dangerous games. So Edge inquires into what are the dangers of games. So they talk about epilepsy, strain injuries, violence, if that's a problem, addictiveness, and if they make you antisocial. And I think their conclusion's pretty correct. So it basically comes down to epilepsy and other physical problems might be real, but they are for a minority. And the mental issues, well, that depends on who you are. It's saying games are addictive, and even if that's the case, to do something about it when it comes to laws would be comparable to saying that, hey, we also have to illegalize porno and some of the best movies and books made, and gambling. Well, but anything that's really exciting. Okay, so here's a Namco commercial showing 5 games released in succession for the PlayStation 1, all having faces with open eyes. Tekken, of course, being the best-selling one. There's also Starblade, the arcade game. Back of shoes. I never got this one, the 1996 hardware guide. Maybe I'll find that on eBay one day. You gotta hurry up a little, because we're only halfway through. Hype, or hip. Well, so here's an in-depth analysis of all the marketing, including the Feather debacle. Here we have Polygon Man, the original mascot for the PlayStation 1, not showing the capabilities of the PlayStation, so he was ditched quickly, but you could find him in the Sony All-Star Fighting game, which is kind of like Smash Brothers. I like this article. It talks about how Sega Saturn tried to use their marketing to be very hip by being somewhat vague and only interesting to the people who knew what the Saturn was about. So you had a lot of that in the mid-90s. I think the Smart brand for the cars did the same, just being very vague and cool. Yeah, that's how the Saturn tried to be attractive. And the PlayStation used another tactic, trying to be trying to say that they're cool by showing that uncool people are against their brand with their saps. So I guess that worked better. I don't know. I think most people just simply went for the system with the best games. But it was a fun time marketing. Let's get into the reviews. Virtua Fighter 2 finally released for the Saturn. 60 frames a second, all the moves, graphics almost as good as the arcade version. You couldn't ask for much more than this. And Edge gives it a 9, rightfully so. It wouldn't save the Saturn, but this was probably the best game for the system. And showing that the Saturn, if you know how to use the system, could make some fairly decent 3D graphics, better looking than Tekken, without doubt. Actual Soccer, made by some British folks, a Gremlin, who also made the Top Gear games and Lotus games. And this, I couldn't find anything that really stuck out about this soccer game. It had good graphics and nice animation, and other than that, it's pretty normal. Gets a 7 out of 10. Hexen gets a 9 out of 10. Edge was a bit too enthusiastic about this one. The sequel to Heretic, and they say it's not revolutionary, but yeah, they say it's just really well done. And they even go so far to say, prepare for the era of the Hexen clone. Well, that never happened. Maybe I should try out the game. I liked Hexen 2, which used the Quake 1 engine. But, yeah. Alright. Edge's online magazine, which will never take off. Polestar, the people who made R-Type, made this game, and it's very similar. I mean, look at that boss, look at your ship. I've never played this game, but it's quite obvious it's just another version of R-Type, and it gets an 8 out of 10. So, it's for the Neo Geo CD. Probably has horrible loading times. Hang On GP95 makes its way to the Saturn and only gets 6 because it's just yet another good-looking race game for the Saturn. Didn't need that, and it doesn't have enough to stick out. Layer Section for the Saturn gets a 7. It's made by Taito, people who made Space Invaders. I don't recall this game being that very good, and it gets a 7 out of 10. So, as you probably guessed, I'm not much on the ball when it comes to side-scrolling shoot-'em-ups. It's just not my genre. Hey Crusader gets an 8 out of 10. It's the top-down isometric shooting game with some strategic points. The controls are a bit messy, but other than that, it's a high production, and it plays well. It's made by Electronic Arts, and everybody liked it at the time, but it didn't have much personality. Starfighter for the 3DO. Probably one of the last good 3DO games. Yet another futuristic flying shooting game. It gets a 7 out of 10. And Edge compares it to the PlayStation 1's Warhawk, which also gets a 7 out of 10. So, but both of them I don't find interesting to recall. Namco Classics has been released. So unfortunately, for me at least, the Retro Review has now, instead of looking at one older game specifically and telling about that, they now tell about a product which has multiple retro games. And they're going to do this for a while. I always love it when Edge looks to the past at older games and tells me things I don't know. But this is just simply shouting out names. We have Galaga and Rally X and Pac-Man, of course, Pole Position, Exevious, Mappy. So all these Namco classics on one disc. Good deal. But not much to learn reading about that. So we're getting to the end. Okay, here's an interview with one Fergus McGovern, who works for Probe. And Probe, you probably know from starting up Mortal Kombat 2 on your Super Nintendo or Genesis, because Probe made those games, converted them, at least on the Super Nintendo version. I'm sorry, I don't know who did the Genesis version. And Probe is probably one of the most boring companies to actually interview, because all they do, at least all they did ever since I believe since the late 80s, was take games that already existed on one platform and convert it to another platform for a company. And at the time, they were bought by Acclaim, so they would work exclusively for Acclaim. And Acclaim at the time didn't release many interesting titles. They had Turok, and that's pretty much it. They were kind of like a richer man's version of LGN, making games like Bart Simpson versus the Space Mutants. Acclaim was usually a company that made subpar games with licenses. They did release, of course, NBA Jam and Mortal Kombat, but those were made by Williams and Midway, so all Acclaim did was port them to the consoles. And there's talk about how Acclaim is doing really well. I mean, they invest apparently in some funny companies. What was it again? In a comic book company or something, and merging with TCI, which is some telephone and cable industry. So Acclaim is getting involved with other things, and the company would last another 10 years, so they didn't do that well with their investments. And Probe, no, I'm confused with another company. Okay, let's finish up this magazine. Some more ads. And Q&A is now 2 pages again. Jeez. And because it got bigger, I thought maybe they would have some interesting questions. Outrun. Why doesn't that get ported to the Saturn? Somebody asks. Hey, if the compression technique of the Ultra 64 cartridges could be 30-1, maybe that's better than CD. But then Edge replies, yeah, well, compressing, that's not necessarily always 30-1. I mean, 4-1 is already fairly good. And that brought some insight to me, because I always wondered why Nintendo 64 games still had loading times, and it's probably because of compression. The console would have to take what's on the cartridge and turning it into RAM. Okay, so some talk about which 3D card for the PC would become the standard. Nowadays we have only 2 on the market. Unfortunately, the preview for next month is replaced by a lot of words. Edge is looking for a new deputy editor. They have a contest about Wipeout. The question is, what previous name did the Chemical Brothers relinquish to avoid being sued by a well-known American DJ combo? So the answer to that is, of course, the Dust Brothers, who made the soundtrack to Fight Club. And that's what the Chemical Brothers first wanted to be named, but that was perhaps a problem. Dave Perry gets married, apparently. And here's another story about the feathers in the previous issue being a problem. In this case, a soldier. Yeah. There was punishment for him because of what he did. And there's also even talk about a retro gaming company called Retro Games. So Edge likes to point them out. I hope they go back to those vague previews again, because it was a lot more fun. So I have no idea what the next issue will be about. I could only speculate. It'll be early 1996. I have no idea. So we'll just have to tune in next time to find out. So this was Edge Magazine 28, and next time we'll be doing Edge Magazine 29. So good to have you, and see you then.